The title of today's lesson, and the theme of today's lesson comes from Numbers chapter 14, verse 24, where we read in that verse, "But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it." That phrase, "a different spirit," is what I would like us to consider today in Caleb, and to see how we can have that same spirit. See what it was about Caleb that was different, and what it is that we can emulate. Now we're going to do a deeper dive into the verses, but if we just to remind ourselves about what it is that's going on here, this is God that's speaking in Numbers chapter 14, verse 24. He's speaking to Moses. And the context of that, we have to go all the way back to chapter 13. And so, as you recall, the Israelites had come out of Egypt. They were going to go to the promised land. They're just camped outside of it. They're about to claim it. And this is the same generation that came out that saw Pharaoh's armies go ahead and be consumed by the Red Sea. The same generation that received the law at Sinai, Mount Sinai. And before they went into the land, in chapter 13, there are 12 spies that are selected, one for each tribe. And when they go there and they spy out the land for 40 days, the land of the Canaanites, the promised land, the land that they are going to inherit, they come back, and 10 of those spies go ahead and say, "No, people are too strong. They're big, they're powerful, they've got fortified cities, we can't do it." And 2 of the spies, Caleb being one of them, and Joshua being the other, after whom the book of Joshua is named, had faith in God and said, "Yep, the people are big, there's no doubt about that, but God is going to give us the victory." And unfortunately, the people of Israel decided to listen to the 10 spies. And it got so bad in verse 4 of chapter 14. So they, the camp of the Israelites, said to one another, "Let us select a leader and return to Egypt." They wanted to go back. In fact, it was so bad they even said, "Forget Moses. We'll replace Moses and we'll go back to Egypt." It gets even worse. In verse 10, when Joshua and Caleb stand up to go ahead and defend Moses and Aaron and defend the report of the good spies, it says, "And all the congregation said to stone them with stones." So they were ready to actually put Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb to death. And it says in verse 10, "Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel." But God not intervened right then and there. Most likely, Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua would have been put to death by the people, and they would have gone back to Egypt. This incurs God's wrath. Verse 11, "How long will these people reject me, and how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you, Moses, a nation greater and mightier than they." But Moses intercedes for the people. God relents. Verse 20, "Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word." Now, what God had pardoned them of was immediate destruction. That generation would not enter. And that is the beginning of the 40 years of wilderness wanderings until that entire generation dies out and their children will go ahead. But as far as putting an end to that group right there on the spot, Moses had interceded and pleaded with them. But there are a couple of exceptions that are made. One is Joshua and the other is Caleb. Everybody of that generation will die and not enter the land of Canaan. But that's where we see our verse for today in verse 24. He says, "But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, and has followed me fully, I will bring him into the land where he went, because he had already gone as a spy, and his descendants shall inherit it. So let me start off by saying what's meant by spirit. Attitude, disposition, is what's there. And he had followed God fully. Now, I'm going to start off by saying that this is a sad verse in one sense, because Caleb is called out as being unique here, a different spirit. But Caleb's spirit should have been the spirit that all of the people had. Okay? All 12 spies should have had the same spirit as Caleb, and all the people that received and listened to the report should have had that same spirit. It is stunningly tragic that in that entire generation, that there are only 2 people that are called out as having a spirit, and God specifically calls upon Caleb here as having that. Our spirit as Christians and attitude is important if we are to be pleasing to God and are to succeed. I want to go ahead and we could obviously have a whole sermon just on Galatians chapter 5, the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. I want to read that list there just for us to go ahead and see how many of the things that are listed in there deal with our attitude. We'll go ahead and we'll start in verse 16 to give the context. I say then, walk in the Spirit, you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh, for the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. If you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law of Moses. Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murder, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, which I tell you beforehand, just as I told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, against which there is no law. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Did you see how many of those lists and each one of them speak to our attitude and our heart and start there? And even the ones which are actions are underpinned by an attitude. Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount, didn't he? He said, the law says, thou shalt not commit adultery, and it does. But then he goes ahead and he pinpoints the actual problem. He says that I tell you that any man who lusts after a woman has committed adultery in his heart already. The attitude that underpins. The same thing Jesus talks about, hatreds and murders. That those that have underpinned there with being angry and having something against a brother unreasonably underpins murder and hatred and outbursts of wrath. So our attitude, if we want to please God, is very important. So what can we learn from Caleb? Let's get into the specifics of his life. In what area did he have a different spirit? I want to start off by calling out the first thing that's immediately obvious is that Caleb had a heart of faith versus a heart of fear. Let's compare their testimonies. Let's start with the 10 spies. What did they say? Well, when they came back, here's their report in verse 27 to 29 of Numbers chapter 13. Then the 10 spies told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Now, God had already told them it was a land flowing with milk and honey, so they're confirming that part. That's not bad so far. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. And then skip down a bit to verse 31, 33. But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw were men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, who came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." They're huge, they're immense, it's fortified, can't be done. This lack of faith, that fear, causes the children of Israel to complain and then rebel. Verse 14, so all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And just picture that. Whole hundreds of thousands of people are weeping through the night because of this. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness." Yes, because that would have been much better. "Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not have been better for us to return to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let us select a leader and return to Egypt." They are terrified, and they're basing their motives on that fear, to the point that they're actually accusing God of some pretty harsh things, aren't they? They say, "What? God's brought us to this land, so we'll all just die by the sword." And he went ahead and said, he's gone ahead, and now our wives and children are going to be killed too, because the God of heaven and earth had nothing better to do with his time, apparently, but to mock a bunch of slaves and put them in this situation. I mean, this is ridiculous what they're accusing God of. Now, look at the heart that Caleb said. And by the way, Caleb saw the same thing that they did. Factually, Caleb is not going to deny that these guys the Canaanites, are stacked, to use our modern terminology. But look at what he said in verse 30 of chapter 13. Then Caleb, and I love this, quieted people before Moses, right? Tone it down, guys, folks. And said, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." Now, how is it that he's able to say that? Where is his confidence coming from? He elaborates on that. Moses and Aaron get a little bit overwhelmed by what's going on in verse 5 of chapter 14, and this is where Joshua and Caleb give their testimony. They're frustrated by this situation as well. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. It's oftentimes in the Old Testament when you see that either a sign of repentance or extreme frustration. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, "The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear." Caleb trusted in God's ability to deliver the victory that he had promised, right? This was not a plan that Caleb and Moses and Aaron and Joshua had come up on their own and said, "Well, I sure do hope God backs us up on this." God had from the very beginning told them that this was their inheritance that was promised to them and that we'd be taken out of the land of Egypt. Now, if God says he's going to do something, he only has to say it once in order for us to trust him. That alone should have been sufficient. But Caleb remembered the promises of God and the number of times in which he had done that. He had done what he said. There were 10 signs that God had performed against Pharaoh, leading up to the people being free. Caleb saw all those signs. Caleb remembered that God had kept his promises. God had delivered them from the hand of Pharaoh and then defeated the army of Pharaoh at the Red Sea. God had provided the pillar by day and the cloud by the cloud by day and the fire by night. The bread from heaven he had provided for their needs. And when Og of Bashan and Sihon of Heshbon, two of the kings, had come out to challenge and attack them, God had delivered the Israelites had delivered the Israelites from them and had given them victory over that. So even if this was the first time that they were seeing God's power, Caleb, I think, would have been, because he had a heart of faith, would have believed. But he remembered all of those times in which God had provided the victory. Their protection had left them. And you know what's very interesting? The Canaanites knew it too. When we look at Joshua, when they finally do go in, Rahab says something interesting to the spies at that point. She says, the terror of you has descended upon all of the people and all of the kings of Canaan. Because they still remember, even 40 years later, how easily Og and Sihon were defeated. And they still remember Egypt. And now you folks have shown up. They were shaking in their boots, right? This would have been, it's not because they were great experienced military tacticians, it's because victory is from God. What is the lesson in us for today? Folks, we face so many opponents to Christianity today. And we have some opponents who are, I would say, big, they're well armed, they're not the giants of the past. Andre referenced a couple of them in his table talk. Just that blinding pride that we have in our accomplishments, in our technology, in our scientific capabilities, which are a blessing from God, to be sure, if we were to recognize God as the source of all that valid and good scientific knowledge and advancement. But instead, we've turned to atheism, evolution, greed. We have a government and we have a society that is greatly opposed. There's a technological and media advantage that is there. There is an array of hosts that are against us. We're mocked quite frequently. We don't suffer persecution here like others do in other countries. And yet, it continues to sort of slide in that direction, so who knows what the scenario may look like at that time. But the promises to us, though, are the same, that God is sovereign, that Jesus has inherited all the nations, that he is in control, and that the victory is still ours even today. There are multiple verses that go ahead and establish this exact same thing. But let's for now just turn to Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 and 6. There the author of Hebrews says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things that you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? The Lord is still with us. If we will trust in his promises and trust that God provides us the victory. The second point is that Caleb put his hand to the work. Caleb was a diligent worker for the Lord. He understood that even though God had made the promise, they still needed to go ahead and do the work. He did that when he was a spy. They needed to go in, they needed to displace. Now, it's got to be rather frustrating to have been Caleb, because he was really looking forward to to the promised land. He was really looking forward to his inheritance. It wouldn't be surprising if during that 40 days when he was there, he was scoping out and maybe pointing out to Joshua, there's right there, that's gonna be mine, it's gonna be my descendants, that's gonna be my house over there. And now Caleb has to go ahead, and he has to wait 40 years for that. He's suffering consequences too. He has to wander around in a circle, just like the rest of those Israelites, for 40 years before attempt number 2 is made. He can be very bitter about that, and he waited patiently on the Lord. Now, his patience is rewarded. We're going to take a look at that. The Israelites, on the other hand, they doubled down on their error. Verse 39 to 45, just going to reference it, not going to read all of those, but basically the people go ahead and say, oh, okay, and this very reminds me, parents probably have seen this, where kids, they go ahead and they do something, and you say that you're going to punish them for it, they don't really believe you, and then you crack down, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay, I'll do it now, I'll clean my room now, I swear, right? And then you're like, no, it's too late, you had your chance, and stuff like that, whatever it is. This is exactly what the Israelites do. They go ahead and they say, oh yeah, okay, we believe you now, God. We believe you now. Now we'll definitely go up and we'll go. And God's answer is already too late, folks. Moses tells them that. If you try to go up now, you're going to lose. And verse 45, as everyone will read in chapter 14, that the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwelled on the mountain came down and attacked them and drove them back as far as Hailah. It's over and done and over with. It's practically now, right? You had your chance, folks. You didn't take it. Now you have to wait 40 years, and it's too late to having to leave. And unfortunately, Caleb and Joshua have to wait 40 years to get their inheritance. But they waited patiently on the Lord, on His timing. And I want you to go ahead and I want you to look at the work that Joshua puts in. God has made many promises to us. That's my pastor. We have to do the work. We have to put the work in. Joshua chapter 14, verses 6 to 15. Caleb inherits Hebron. And the children of Judah came to Joshua in Gilgal. And Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, you know the word which the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought back word to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. But I wholly followed the Lord my God. So Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land where your foot has trodden shall be your inheritance and your children's forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, ever since the Lord spoke this word to Moses. Well, Israel wandered in the wilderness, and now here I am on this day, 85 years old. As yet I am as strong this day as on the day that Moses sent me. Just as my strength was then, so now is my strength for war, both for going out and for coming in. Now therefore, give me this mountain, in which the Lord spoke in that day, and you heard in that day how the Anakim were there, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. And Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb the son of Jephunneh as an inheritance. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord God of Israel. And the name of Hebron formerly was Kirjath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim, when the land had rest from the war. He still had to do a fair of the land. He still had to do the work, but he was fully committed. And this is absolutely astounding. This is an 85-year-old man going ahead and doing the work and clearing things out. Now, well, God had clearly blessed him and kept him in good physical health. But I don't know about you, but there's not too many 85-year-olds that are actually going out there and are this active. But he puts to shame even the ones that were half his age, that were in that 20 to 40 40-year-old bracket. Now, details of the clearing are given in Joshua chapter 15, verse 13 to 19. For time's sake, we won't read through that, but it describes all the work that Caleb did. There is also an account in Judges chapter 1, verse 12 to 20, of all of the work that Caleb did to do that, to go ahead and secure his land. I will call your attention, though, that shamefully, and you'll see this in the early part of Judges. Look at verse 21 of Judges chapter 1. Actually, we'll go ahead and go verse 20 because for the contrast. And they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses has said, and he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak. There goes the giants. Verse 21, but the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Then go ahead and skip to verse 27. However, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean and his villages, or Kenan and his villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and his villages, or the inhabitants of Eglon and his villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo. Yes, that same Megiddo that Armageddon is named after, and its villages, for the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. Well, no wonder they were determined, it was their home. But the Israelites should have prevailed against it because God had promised it. Verse 29, nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. So the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Verse 30, nor did Zebulun, you get the point. Nor did this, nor did that, nor did this, nor did that, nor did this. They left a whole bunch, became a thorn in their side, and eventually it led them into idolatry. Do you know who didn't shirk the work? An 85-year-old man. An 85-year-old man cleared out the land, cleared out the mountain, and even took out and cleared out the giants. While the rest of the 40-year-olds slacked off and didn't do and put their hand to the work. I think the lesson in that should be rather obvious to us. I'm not going to belabor the point. I will turn to John chapter 4. And I just want to say that when it comes to that work, for us to be diligent, we have to be about it. When we turn to John chapter 4, that's the text where it's the Samaritan woman at the well in the Samaritan village. And because of that exchange, that entire village is essentially converted to Christ. But in verse 35, when the disciples come back, Jesus says this to them. Do not say, there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest. Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. In another text similar to this, he says, pray the Lord sends laborers out into the harvest. Now, so there is a lot of work to be done, and Jesus is saying, it's not going to be 4 months from now, folks. That harvest is right. And there's people that are out there that need to be in that field and working. Now, the problem with saying, and I'm not saying that Jesus obviously had a problem here, I'm just saying that for the hearer, you'll get what I'm about to say, with saying, pray that the Lord send laborers, is we know how our minds work sometimes and the disciples' minds work because we saw it in the foot wash and we see it in other instances. It almost falls into that category when somebody says, somebody should do this, right? And there's always a parenthesis when somebody says somebody should take care of this. It's always somebody, bracket, other than me, should take care of this, right? But that is not the attitude that we should have. And just like when we look at Caleb, an 85-year-old man who's about to work, what's our excuse? No, rather the attitude that we should have as servants and the spirit that we should have is found in Isaiah chapter 6. It's a simple verse. It's the throne room of God. Isaiah is beginning his work as a prophet. In verse 8, it says, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Now, what a contrast what you're about to see between Isaiah and Moses. Because without hesitation, then Isaiah said, here I am, send me. Now, Moses is a tremendously amazing servant of God. His humility and his life are a great example for us, and we could have entire sermons on that. Moses had a rough start, though. The burning bush, God says, Moses, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. And the rest of the chapter is Moses making excuses, right to the point of, you've got the wrong guy, God, send somebody else, right? Look at the attitude of Caleb, one who has a different spirit, where he's at 85 years old clearing out a mountain of Canaanites and the surrounding area, and the attitude of Isaiah right here. Here I am, send me. What work needs to be done, and what can I do? If we start with that attitude of what can I do, how can I help, we'll find some area in which we can help. Not everybody has to do the exact same work. There's a lot of different tasks that need to be done, but let's have that attitude that Caleb had, and let's have that attitude that we just saw here in Isaiah. Here I am, send me. The final point that I'd like to drive home from our text is that Caleb dared to stand alone. Now, that is not always easy, to be in the minority. And it probably may be surprised, I don't want to speculate too much here, that the 10 that had gone with Caleb and Joshua, that they're only focusing on the obstacle, only focusing on the resistance, and not what God had given them. Had to be discouraging, and it very well may have even been a little bit intimidating. Things got so hairy for them. As I said in verse 10, the congregation is ready to go ahead and put them to death, all because of what's their crime? Their crime is reminding their brethren that God had delivered them, and God would be with them if they went into the land. That's their crime for which they're about to be put to death. But there's no indication here that Caleb backed down from what was right, even in the face of that. And who knows, if God not intervened, what would have happened? Sometimes we will be alone. Our brethren can be a tremendous source of blessing. In fact, I think that oftentimes that is one of the primary blessings that God has put in our life, is our brothers and sisters in Christ. Unfortunately, sometimes our brethren, because of wickedness, may not stand with us. But sometimes it's not even a matter of that. Sometimes we can go ahead and just not have our brothers or sisters there because they're dealing with things in their own life. We have a brother that Paul, the Apostle Paul, who is well acquainted with that, who has a very different spirit, I guess you could say, like Caleb. His experiences, 2 Timothy, if you want to turn there, in chapter 4, is widely regarded as Paul's last epistle. That he would be put to death there. The number of statements that he makes in that epistle reveal that I think he knew that his life was near an end. But let's look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, go ahead and look at verse 9, starting there to 16. Be diligent to come to me quickly, he's writing to Timothy. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. And Titus I have sent to Ephesus. Bring the cloak that I had left with Carpus and Troas when you come, and books, especially the parchments. Alexander's accomplishment did me much harm, may the Lord repay him according to his works. You also must be aware of him, for he is greatly resisted without warnings. At my first defense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. cannot be charged against them. We don't know the circumstances under which they're. Some of them may have been malicious, like Demas and Alexander. Some of them may have just had things happen. We don't know. But Christ never abandons us, and Paul knew that. The Lord is faithful. Verse 17 and 18, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me, and that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. And the Lord will deliver me from every evil work and preserve me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. Caleb understood that. He understood that the Lord was with him, even when everybody else was against him. So what can we learn in conclusion from our brother Caleb? We can choose to have faith in life circumstances over fear. We can be inspired by his willingness to put his hand to the work. And we can be inspired by his example of standing up for what is right, even when nobody else is willing to do so. And I'm sure there's many other aspects that we could emphasize of Caleb's life and attitude, and that applies to Joshua as well, though I find it very interesting that God just calls out Caleb in that text, calls out in a positive way. So I hope this has been beneficial to you. I hope that in your own life you can think about ways in which you can be inspired by our brother Caleb, and perhaps you can think of ways in which he has that different spirit as well. Maybe cultivate that different spirit in our life.